The morning mist rolled across the rice fields of ancient Japan, softening the edges of the villages scattered between mountains and rivers. Farmers bent low over the paddies, their straw hats bobbing like boats upon a restless sea of green shoots. Yet beneath this peaceful surface lay a land divided, where emperors ruled in name, but powerful clans fought quietly for influence. It was within this tension, between the courtly elegance of Kyoto and the rough frontier provinces, that the first samurai began to emerge. The word samurai did not yet carry the weight of legend. In the late Heian period, 794–1185, it simply meant those who serve. They were originally retainers, armed men employed by noble families to protect estates, enforce order, and collect taxes. At first, they were not the polished warriors of later centuries. They were rough riders, bowmen, and swordsmen, hardened by provincial life. Their task was not glorious, but necessary, to ensure the rice harvest reached Kyoto without being stolen by bandits or rival clans. Yet slowly, these mounted guards began to shape a culture of their own. In Kyoto, the imperial court was steeped in refinement. Aristocrats composed poetry, painted delicate fans, and performed court dances. Politics unfolded in whispered intrigue, not in open battle. But beyond the capital, in the provinces, life was harsher. The Fujiwara clan dominated court politics, but they could not control the vast stretches of farmland and remote borders. For this, they relied on the rising military clans, families like the Minamoto and the Taira, who were building their power not with silk and ink but with steel and blood. As the 10th century dawned, local conflicts intensified. Land disputes, raids and uprisings threatened the fragile order. The aristocrats in Kyoto found themselves increasingly dependent on their provincial enforcers. The samurai, once mere guards, were becoming indispensable. A samurai of the Heian frontier lived a life very different from the court nobles. His hands bore the calluses of daily training with bow and sword. His horse was his companion, his armor his second skin. His world was not measured by poems or ceremonies, but by the honor of his family and the loyalty to his lord. They trained endlessly with the yumi, the powerful asymmetrical bow of the Japanese warrior. Battles of this era were often decided at range, with mounted archers trading volleys before charging with swords. To strike down an enemy with a well-placed arrow was considered not only skillful, but spiritually significant, a test of a warrior's discipline and the will of the gods. Still, swords were carried. The straight, single-edged chakuto slowly gave way to the curved blade that would one day become the katana. These early swords, paired with a small companion blade, reflected the growing identity of the samurai as both warrior and servant of tradition. The first great test of the samurai came in the uprisings that shook the Heian period. One of the earliest was the rebellion of Taira no Masakado in 939. A powerful warrior of the eastern provinces, Masakado declared himself the new emperor and launched a revolt against Kyoto. For a moment he seemed unstoppable, gathering warriors under his banner and striking fear into the court. But in 940, his rebellion collapsed. Masakado was hunted down and beheaded, his head sent to Kyoto as a grim warning. Yet his rebellion revealed a deeper truth. The imperial court could no longer enforce its authority without warriors. The samurai were no longer just protectors of estates, they were kingmakers and challengers of power. Not long after, another conflict, the Zenkunen War, former 9 Years' War, from 1051 to 1063, erupted in the north. The Abe clan resisted imperial authority, and it was the Minamoto who were called to suppress them. In fierce battles fought across snowy plains and forested mountains, the Minamoto proved themselves formidable. Their victories cemented their reputation as one of Japan's great warrior families. The cycle repeated with the later 3 Years' War, 1083–1087, again in the northern provinces. Once more, it was the Minamoto who brought order. their blades carving a legend that would echo for generations. Though the word bushido, the way of the warrior, would not appear until centuries later, its seeds were already sown. Loyalty, honor, and courage were the values whispered around campfires and written in the blood of battle. A samurai's worth was measured not only by his skill with a blade, but by his devotion to his lord and his willingness to sacrifice his life for duty. This growing ethos set the samurai apart from mere mercenaries. They were bound not only by contracts, but by a spiritual calling. A warrior who betrayed his lord brought shame not only to himself, but to his entire family line. Death was preferable to dishonor. By the late Heian period, two clans towered above all others, the Taira and the Minamoto. Both had earned their place through decades of battle, serving as the iron fist of the aristocracy. But their ambitions grew larger than their masters in Kyoto. What began as service would soon become rivalry, and what began as rivalry would erupt into war. The samurai were no longer a shadow force on the edges of society. They were the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, ready to unleash thunder upon the land. The rise of the samurai was not complete, but the path was set. Soon, the clash of Taira and Minamoto would give birth to the first shogunate, and Japan would be forever ruled by the sword. The sun set behind the hills of Kamakura, casting long shadows across the wooden halls of the new military government. For centuries, emperors and aristocrats had ruled Japan from the splendor of Kyoto, but now power had shifted. A warrior sat at the center of authority. The shogun and the samurai had risen from provincial guards to the rulers of a nation. This was the dawn of the Kamakura shogunate, 1185–1333, born out of blood, betrayal, and the clash of clans. The rivalry between the Taira and the Minamoto, forged in the crucible of the late Heian period, erupted into full-scale civil war in 1180. Known as the Genpei War, this 5-year conflict would determine the fate of Japan. The Taira, who had entrenched themselves in Kyoto, were powerful and wealthy, but their arrogance had bred resentment. The Minamoto, long hardened by battles in the northern provinces, rallied support from discontented warriors and ambitious monks. Battles raged across rivers, mountains, and coastal plains. Samurai clashed in mounted archery duels, each warrior announcing his name and lineage before loosing arrows into the fray. Honor still guided their combat, though increasingly, survival demanded cunning as much as bravery. The war culminated in the Battle of Danno-ura, 1185, a naval clash in the narrow straits of Shimonoseki. The Taira fleet, carrying the young Emperor Antoku, faced the Minamoto onslaught. Arrows darkened the sky, ships crashed together, and chaos engulfed the sea. When defeat became inevitable, many Taira nobles threw themselves into the water, choosing death over capture. Even the child emperor was carried into the waves by his grandmother, vanishing beneath the tide. From that moment, the Taira were finished, and the Minamoto stood supreme. Minamoto no Yoritomo emerged as the first shogun, establishing his government in Kamakura. The emperor remained in Kyoto, but his role was ceremonial. The real power rested in the hands of the warrior class. The Kamakura shogunate marked a new era. The samurai were no longer just retainers of nobles, they were the rulers of Japan. Land, military service, and loyalty became the foundation of the new order. Samurai who had fought for the Minamoto were rewarded with estates, binding them to the shogunate through networks of obligation. The relationship between lord and vassal grew into a defining feature of samurai life. A samurai pledged loyalty to his lord, who in return provided protection and rewards. This was the seed of feudal Japan, a system that would endure for centuries. But with power came responsibility. Yoritomo's shogunate had to balance the ambitions of countless warrior families. The slightest spark could ignite rebellion. Thus, law codes were established, disputes settled in military courts, and discipline enforced through both reward and punishment. The 13th century brought a challenge unlike any before. From the distant steppes of Mongolia, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, sought to conquer Japan. Twice, in 1274 and 1281, the Mongols launched massive invasions, bringing fleets filled with warriors from across Asia. The samurai had never faced such an enemy. The Mongols fought not in honorable duels, but with overwhelming force, volleys of arrows, thunderous drums, and terrifying explosive weapons. Samurai, who rode forth to announce their names, were cut down without ceremony. In the first invasion, the Mongols landed in Kyushu, burning villages and clashing with local defenders. The samurai fought fiercely but were pushed back. Then, suddenly, a storm struck the Mongol fleet, sinking ships and scattering survivors. The Japanese believed the gods had intervened. In 1281, the Mongols returned with an even larger force. Some 140,000 men, the greatest armada the world had ever seen. Again, the samurai resisted with desperate courage, building coastal defenses and striking at the enemy in night raids. And once more, a great storm swept the seas, smashing the invaders' fleet to pieces. The Japanese called it the kamikaze, the divine wind. To the samurai, it was proof that the gods favored their land. Yet behind the glory lay hardship. The long defense bankrupted many samurai who received little reward for their sacrifices. Discontent simmered beneath the surface. By the early 14th century, cracks appeared in the Kamakura shogunate. The imperial court, though weakened, sought to regain its authority. In 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo launched a rebellion, enlisting warriors to his cause. For a brief moment, imperial rule was restored in what became known as the Kenmu Restoration. But the emperor's attempt to govern without warriors soon failed. Disillusioned samurai turned against him, rallying behind Ashikaga Takauji, a former ally who betrayed the throne. In 1336, Takauji seized power, founding the Ashikaga shogunate. The Ashikaga period, 1336–1573, was both brilliant and chaotic. The shoguns ruled from Kyoto, closer to the emperor and the old aristocracy, but their grip on power was weak. The country fractured into rival domains, each controlled by powerful daimyo, warlords. Civil war erupted in 1467 with the Onin War, a decade-long conflict that reduced Kyoto to ashes. Samurai fought street by street, temple by temple, until the city was a blackened ruin. The war destroyed the authority of the shogunate and ushered in a century of anarchy, the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. Yet even as war raged, samurai culture blossomed. The Ashikaga shoguns were great patrons of the arts. Under their rule, the tea ceremony, no theater, and Zen gardens flourished. Samurai lords sought not only to prove themselves on the battlefield, but also to display refinement and sophistication. This balance of sword and brush defined the samurai ideal. Warriors who could compose poetry as easily as they could strike an enemy. To be a true samurai was to master both the way of war and the way of culture. By the late 15th century, Japan was splintered into dozens of competing domains, each ruled by ambitious warlords. Samurai no longer fought for distant shoguns, but for the lords who commanded their loyalty. Castles rose on hilltops, alliances shifted like the wind, and blood stained every province. The golden age of the samurai had reached its height and was about to plunge into its most violent chapter yet, the Sengoku Jidai, the warring states era. In this crucible of conflict, new legends would be forged, and the very nature of samurai warfare would be transformed. Across the fractured landscape of Japan, daimyo vied for supremacy. The old codes of honor that had guided samurai combat began to give way to pragmatism and cunning. No longer did warriors announce themselves before battle. Surprise attacks and ambushes became common. The mounted archer, once the epitome of samurai prowess, found himself increasingly outmatched by foot soldiers wielding long spears and primitive firearms. It was in this era that the samurai truly became synonymous with the sword. The katana, forged with exquisite skill and imbued with spiritual significance, became the soul of the warrior. Swordsmanship schools proliferated, each claiming to hold the secret to victory. Yet even as combat grew more brutal, the ideal of the cultured warrior persisted. In the brief lulls between battles, samurai pursued the arts with fervor. The tea ceremony, with its emphasis on simplicity and mindfulness, offered a moment of tranquility amidst chaos. Poetry contests were held in castle halls, still echoing with the clash of steel. This was the paradox of the samurai, men who could contemplate the beauty of a cherry blossom even as they prepared to spill blood. Their lives were a constant balance between violence and refinement, loyalty and ambition, tradition and innovation. As the 16th century dawned, three great unifiers would emerge from the chaos of the Sengoku period: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Each would leave an indelible mark on the samurai class and on Japan itself. Their struggles would bring an end to centuries of civil war, but also herald the twilight of the samurai's golden age. The sun that had risen over Kamakura was setting now, casting long shadows across a changed Japan. The samurai, once provincial warriors, had risen to rule an empire. They had faced Mongol invasions, weathered civil wars, and created a culture that would endure for centuries. But as peace slowly returned to the land, the role of the warrior class would be forever altered. The age of the sword was giving way to the age of the pen, and the samurai would have to adapt or fade into history.